So there are 6 tantric vehicles, and so of the total number of vehicles is 9. And so the 3 highest levels of tantra in so we're talking about Tibetan Buddhism here, Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, Vajrayana. And so the 3 highest levels are Maha Yoga, Anu Yoga, and Ati Yoga, or Dzogchen. And it seems that you can kind of take a look at these different vehicles, especially these 3 highest vehicles, and then try to understand what they are trying to accomplish. And that's an interesting exercise. So I don't know if the interpretation that we will discuss, whether that's something that will be palatable for a traditional Vajrayana expert, but we're allowed to speculate, and we're allowed to try to use Tantra as a framework to kind of understand something about possible practices that you can use for transformation. And so it seems that Maha Yoga is very much concerned with identity. So one of the key practices of Maha Yoga is Yidam practice. And Andrew, I know you know more about these things than I do, so please correct me if I make a mistake. So Maha Yoga is very much concerned with identity, and one of the practices is Yidam practice, where you do visualizations of yourself as a Buddhist deity. So that's one of the core practices of Maha Yoga. This is called the generation stage.
Generation phase, yeah. I could say a couple things about that. Is that that is basically what you do is your psychosomatic image of yourself as, me, Andrew, Sweeny, or whatever, is what you usually impute on yourself. And so you turn that around and you impute that on the image of a deity, usually saying a mantra, and the deity is often feminine. So if you're a man, you're often visualizing a sexy red woman or something like that, so you're visualizing your inner self, and you're with all of these various accoutrements and symbols and in a dynamic play of some sort, and so you do that repeatedly for a long time until you lose your own psychosomatic perception of yourself, and transform that to the deity. So your actual perception becomes deity. Deity is a kind of perception, if that makes any sense to people.
I would add that that's probably how religion worked to begin with. So, a deity, the way we use it today, we're completely colored by this sort of, it's not even Christian, it's sort of a late Protestant Christian idea that God is like an old man sitting on a cloud being bored, listening to people on Facebook all day long and giving them likes, which of course not what a God is at all. I mean, in most cultures, gods refer to, the forefather or the foremother or some kind of idea of what somebody could be or potentially has been, or and then you project that. And of course, you can also project that onto yourself. For example, when you sit in front of a saint, and you pray to the saint is the saint for you and your kind, your archetype. And therefore you pray to this saint who will then pray to God. But you pray to this saint, obviously, to mimic that saint and try to transfer that personality onto yourself.
Yeah. So and I should also add that it's not considered to be the end of a path. It's a skillful means. In other words, the deity that it's like when you watch a movie, you get involved in this movie. You don't think the movie is real, but you get involved so much in this that it becomes real, and then you dissolve that. You get so involved in the icon or the deity or whatever that, and then that dissolves, and then you move on to the next step when you've mastered that particular step.
Yeah. So it's actually interesting, Alexander, that you said about praying, like praying to a saint. So in the lower tantras, there you visualize the deity in front of you. So in the higher up you go, so in Maha Yoga, you actually meditate that you are the deity yourself. So you have this succession, and obviously this is something that plays around with identity, right? So you get rid of this very fixed identity of self. I am this person who works there, and that's my name. And so of course there's nothing wrong with that, but there's often a certain rigidness about these identities that make you inflexible to deal with a wide range of situations. And so you could interpret Maha Yoga as an attempt to create a potential of different forms of being that fit many different circumstances.
Yeah.
And many of these deities, they have a specific flavor. So some deities are peaceful, some deities are wrathful. So that means that there is anger involved or there is lust involved. So you become familiar with in a meditation pose, you become familiar with these very passionate ways of being by visualizing yourself as a deity. So that's the essence of Maha Yoga.
And you might be given the deity which suits your particular neurosis or a personality type. Like if you're an angry type of person, you might be given I don't know, you might be given an angry deity or a peaceful deity or the opposite sometimes, or you would be given something that would help you work with whatever energetic neurosis you might have. So the deity, so the neurosis becomes you don't get rid of it. It becomes the deity as well. Like it becomes an ornament. They call it ornament. It becomes like an ornament.
That makes sense, because this is exactly what monotheism gets wrong with polytheism. And I've always argued that they operate in parallel. They can never be seen as, it's just two different religions, but under the same religion, in the sense that monotheism always deals with some kind of an exodus. There's a point to which you're going. There's a new era in front of you, or a new territory in front of you that you need to sort of conquer. You need to arrive there. So you set up your ambitions to get there, and you take those who are with you, your chosen ones with you, to go there. That's what we call exodology in our work. So that's part of it. That's what monotheism does. Monotheism is always concerned with some point in the future, and that's exactly what needs only one God. Or actually, when you say you can have no other gods beside me, it actually doesn't deny that there are other gods. It doesn't deny that there's a need for other gods. Monotheism just says that when it comes to the monotheistic endeavor, that's concerned with only one God, which is usually a phallic entity of some kind we're walking towards into the future. But this exact polytheism is absolutely necessary. You can take Catholicism, for example. When Catholicism tried to introduce the sort of Jewish monotheism, which worked maybe for Judaism because it was a small religion with only one nation and one language. But when Christianity became a universal religion, Catholicism realized that it didn't work to have only one God. And of course, the God was split up to begin with because the phallus has to be split. But then next, Catholicism was smart enough to introduce all the saints. And so did, of course, Orthodox Christianity. This is what's desperately lacking in Protestant Christianity, which is exactly why it's out of Northern and Western Europe, out of Protestant Christianity, that we get all the idol worship we have today, all these stars and celebrities and all these things that we got. And they came out of the idea that the monarch should be supreme. The monarch should be absolute supreme, directly under God, and be the second God. So polytheism was replaced with monarchy. And that's, of course, a terrible way of doing polytheism, because the point of what we're talking about here in Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, and actually what works in Catholicism, is that if you install a second layer of polytheism that people can go to directly, they go directly to Virgin Mary, they go directly to the saints. They don't have to go directly to God, because that's like unfathomable for people to go directly to the Lord Father.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. You start with the Virgin Mary, and then that's the intercession towards meeting God. So that's why you do Maha Yoga practice, in a sense.
And that's why it's so early here. That's what's so early. It sounds shocking to kind of pretend you're a god or pretend you're a deity at this stage, but it actually does make sense, because that is exactly what we do. We mimic properly. There's another way of doing this, but it's kind of a very modern shortcut. But it's, of course, the psychedelic experience. And if the psychedelic experience is properly done, it can be a shortcut to this, because obviously we do a psychedelic experience. Again, we look at some kind of deity, we pretend we're that deity. And of course, we get stuck in that. We get stuck with the psychedelic psychosis. That's why they're risky to take. But of course, if you can just be in a state where you stay temporarily and then you get out of it, psychedelics can do the same thing. The pointer is to do what Slavoj Žižek calls to get a parallax view of yourself. So you don't have just one perspective of who you are, but you actually look at yourself from different viewpoints, to start with, from the way other people look at you. And by having these different viewpoints of your identity, you get a sound identity. You don't get this sort of narcissistic stuck identity, but you have an identity which is much more fluid and dialectical.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that that this was related to this parallax view of Zizek. That's what it refers to. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, the whole deity practice is a parallax universe. It's an entire universe of,
Well, we all three speak at least two languages, and we also know that if you speak two or more languages, you can finally understand what language is. Yeah. You can't even remotely understand what a language is if you only speak one. Because you're really literally going to believe. if you speak only one language, you're really literally going to believe that all the symbols are real in that language.
Yeah.
When you speak two, and the second you discover that, oh, there's no word for this in that language, but I have a word for that in the other language, you sort of want to jump over there. Then you realize, okay, a language is, you can only think as well as the language you have. And if you have two or more languages, access to two or more, you're immediately more intelligent. That's a perfect example of what the parallax view means.
Yeah.
And this obviously is training towards that.
And Maha Yoga is a whole language of symbols, which is totally bizarre from the conventional point of view. Totally bizarre. Like, it makes no sense whatsoever to a conventional point of view. I don't think. And you would only get there if you were working with a teacher who was teaching you this language and how to inhabit this parallax.
So you would then, guessing here, I'm the least literate on this of the three of us, but then if you're a teacher, you would obviously have a student in front of you who really needs just to mimic something and then do it. Or you'd have somebody in front of you who'd like to challenge and who needs to challenge. And obviously you can play around with the deities accordingly, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
Cool. So are we going to go into Hatha yoga?
Normal stage of things you go through, right? Which are, but one person might be happier in this stage and the other person might be happier in this stage, and depending on your capacities and how good you are at doing these kind of unusual practices.
So isn't there, so just to come back to this Zizek and parallax view, is this also related to Deleuze with his schizoid analysis?
No, I think that's what's lacking. And the interesting thing about Zizek is that he did write Organs Without Bodies. By the way, the book where he talked about me and Söderqvist quite a lot. But he did write Organs Without Bodies. It was his sort of dealing with Deleuze right before he wrote the parallax view. So that led into the parallax view, which I now regard as one of his 2 or 3 most important books. I would always say less than nothing is his masterpiece. And I would say the parallax view is also a very, very good, interesting book. Where he goes
what's the
deep.
difference between the Deleuzian schizoid analysis and the parallax view of Zizek?
Because in the schizoanalysis, you don't have that point. The pointer is you have a point and you look at the point from different perspectives. That's why it's a parallax and not a parallel. That's exactly the point. Parallax, completely different mathematically. So the point is the same, but you just move over from another direction and look at it. That's why I say it's similar to the psychedelic experience. What you learn from the psychedelic experience is that you can look at the world completely differently, and it isn't necessarily wrong. It's just very different. Colors can look very different from what you assume they would look like. Angles can be very different from what you look like. So you realize that my vision can fool me. I have a sobriety here. I have a sober perspective of reality, but it's just sober. It's not necessarily correct. And to understand the difference between sobriety and correctness is exactly the kind of lesson you learn from doing a psychedelic experience. Obviously, that is exactly the point here as well.
Yeah.
By having different ways of looking at yourself, you dissolve your identity, but that's where Deleuze gets stuck. So Deleuze does not unite the identity again. The problem with Deleuze is that he's an anarchist romantic. Felix Guattari was so even more. And the problem with Deleuze is that you cannot finish off with Deleuze. You have to bring Hegel and Zizek and other guys into the picture to unify the whole thing again. Because at the end of the day, you got to have a sense of self before you go on to the next step. You cannot go from one area here to another area here without having a sense of self in between. The self is always like this. The problem I haven't solved, but that I will postpone until tomorrow. And therefore you can go to bed at night with a strong sense of self, not because you solved the problem before you went to bed, but because you decided to keep the problem, identify with it, and then start solving it tomorrow. That is what a sense of self is in Hegel and Lacan.
And in the Maha Yoga, it's radical because you're shifting that sense of self, and often, yes, intoxicants are part of that because you're intoxicating the ego or you're intoxicating the sense of self, so that it comes out of its limited or conditioned or mechanical perspective. That makes any sense?
Yeah, I would say you're not really shifting the self; you're shifting the perspective of the self, aren't you? Isn't that the point? It's not the self that's jumping around; it is the angle at which you're looking at the self that's shifting. Because that's the way I've always perceived it. And of course, I'm judging because of my background in psychoanalysis and in psychedelics. I'm judging it on that point because it makes perfect sense then. And that's exactly why a deity is you identify with the deity. Thomas said this was all about identity. You identify with the deity as if you were the deity. That is not a different self. That is just identifying the self differently from a different angle.
Well,
that
ultimately,
is why parallax is a good word here.
Ultimately, they say perception is the deity, which I think is kind of interesting. Like, you know,
yeah, perspective, perception. There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this is a good point to introduce then the next level. So we have Maha Yoga, and then the next level. So that's the vehicle number 8. So the first 3 vehicles are sutric vehicles, and then you have 6 tantric vehicles. So vehicle number 8 is Anu Yoga. So and that so what you say, like, you know, you look at the self from different perspectives and stuff like that. So there's some kind of, so in Maha Yoga there's still a certain amount of artifice about
contrivance. Yeah.
You do these visualizations and you do these meditations and you visualize yourself as a specific deity, and you learn how to do this visualization very precisely in the course of your meditation practice. But then Anu Yoga kind of takes away some of the artifice. So it brings in the body much more. And there the mandala and the deity that you carefully constructed in Maha Yoga is much more spontaneous. You can kind of say it like it's more like you act without thinking. You know, you have a certain stance in the world, a certain way of being that spontaneously arises. But in practice, Anu Yoga is also very much involved with so-called subtle body practices. And these are meditations. For example, there's Tumo meditation, inner fire meditation. There's stuff like Tsalung. There's stuff like True Core. So these are meditations that very much involve visualizing the body. They also often involve movements. True Core and Tsalung is meditation, yoga, and movement combined. So they work with something that's called the subtle body, and that is basically it's experiencing the body in a completely different way, in a much more spacious way. And instead of interpreting your emotions with language, you actually experience them more as bodily manifestations. So fear is a pattern of bodily circumstances rather than something that you put into language. So that's Anu Yoga. So and if you so the Wim Hof practice, that is actually a westernized form of Anu Yoga. So Wim Hof goes back to inner fire meditation, Tumo meditation, and so he basically kind of cleaned that up and put his own twist on it. So Tumo, inner fire meditation, is done in Tibet in the snow. So it's actually proven, and so there's a Nature article about it. There's an article in PLOS ONE, which is a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And so these monks, they can meditate in the snow and they can raise their body temperature. That's why
they can just sit there in the snow for a long time. I've met people who are good at this, and I was with this guy in Hamburg who was very good at this, and he was walking around with no shirt, and it was like -20. He was totally relaxed. He'd been doing these practices for years.
So that's Anu Yoga, and also Anu Yoga. So there are many indications that this is kind of a sublimated sexual practice, because also Anu Yoga is very much linked to Karma Mudra, which are these sexual tantric practices, which are quite old. So I think that the first really hard evidence of these practices is the 7th, 8th century, something like that, or even older documents that seem to refer to these practices. So Anu Yoga kind of makes this visualization of the self as deity and the mandala. It makes it much more embodied, and it makes it much more spontaneous. So that would be my take on it. So
and I would say that Maha Yoga apparently gets rid of I'm just quoting Chaktim here, the gross obscurations of a sort of the vulgar obscurations, and Ana Yoga works on the subtle obscurations, of perception. So it moves from gross to subtle, even though both are kind of, you don't want to be too linear in thinking about them, because they're kind of both happening at
what does it mean with obscurations? So just clarify that.
Well, obscurations depression or false images of yourself or neurosis or whatever it is that is, these practices are extraordinarily therapeutic if they're done properly. If they're not, they work better than psychoanalysis. So I would say just your neurotic psychosomatic self gets put in a washing machine and comes out as something different each time you go through one of these cycles of practice.
Well,
does that make sense, Thomas?
Are basically treating yourself or others as objects, often
Yeah.
yourself too. So if you think of yourself as a thing, or somebody else as a thing, that would be an obscuration. So this is related to this concept of emptiness, which is often very fluffy and stuff like that. But I basically just interpret it as Whiteheadian process, right, where you see yourself as a process rather than as a thing that adopts different properties. So that's one of the interpretations of emptiness. So every time you treat somebody as a thing, well, I mean, let's not. It can be very useful, actually. But I mean,
you mean there are sex objects out there, for example?
Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, sometimes you do calculations, or I mean, you organize events and stuff like that. I mean, you shouldn't.
There's no such thing as a thing from an ultimate point from the ultimate point of view.
Right? Ultimately,
there's no such thing as things from that point. That's the point of view, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that we don't treat them as things, because we have absolute and relative truth, right? And there's the absolute and relative way of looking at things. I mean, I'm just quoting.
Well, of course, Tantra is inclusive, so you can.
Well, this is what's fucking amazing about Tantra is it does include the body, right? It does include the object, the thing, so it's kind of like, it's very subtle, because you could fool yourself into this is what I was trying to say in my thing. You could fool yourself into making that some kind of because it's deeper than just I don't know, I think.
But this was the problem with psychoanalysis all along, wasn't it? Because psychoanalysis was a couch, and an authority of some kind who turned his back on you didn't make him less of an authority, did it? No, worked the other way around. And that was always the problem with both Freud and Lacan. And at least we arrived at a point that we realized, okay, that's a limitation we can't really live with, because you can sit theoretically and talk about how important the body is and how embodied you must be, but it doesn't make any sense if it's not part of the practice. And it never was.
So this is the radicality of Tantra, as the embodied aspect of the practice, I think. I mean, this is what I am told. Again, I don't want to put myself forward as some kind of expert here, because I'm not, but I think it's all about the body, right? There's no enlightenment without the body, whereas Sutric practices is about this is still a two worlds mythology, to use John Vervaeke's term. There's still, you're trying to get away from bodily experience and experience some kind of nirvana, but that's not the view of Tantra, right?
Yeah, there's some escapism involved there, because so first of all, there's a revulsion of the body, a revulsion of sexuality, because it's involved with desire. And then there's also meditation practices such as the jhanas, where you can basically just meditate yourself away, where you can just sit down for hours in meditative bliss and emptiness. And the problem is that it's very pleasant, but it doesn't necessarily make you an attractive party person or somebody that other people want to be around, right? I mean, you're just sitting on a pillow in your own universe. But it's very useful. These things are very useful. They can be used to good effect, or they can be abused as escapism, right? So that's why you have these vehicles. So every vehicle corrects the dangers and the shortcomings of the previous vehicle. So it's not so that the first vehicle is poor and the second one is better. So it's just that, well, you start with a certain practice, and that practice solves certain problems, but it also creates other problems. And then you correct it with another vehicle, and then you have other problems. And so there's no end to it. And then you have the highest level, which is the ninth vehicle, and that's Ati Yoga or Dzogchen. And that's kind of like always very difficult. I never know how to describe it. It's basically kind of like letting go of structured practice, but at the same time you don't. So it's kind of like a certain, it unifies Sutra and Tantra, and at the same, so it unifies them and it transcends them. So Dzogchen is often described as the path of the lazy yogi, because there's nothing to
the
do.
old dog, or
that in itself is then the old dog, or the old man basking in the sun, and then of course it's then said, well, yeah, but this practice of doing nothing, there's nothing to do, is actually very difficult. So you kind of get just blown away by all these paradoxes. So that's the final vehicle, the ninth vehicle.
Yeah, and this really plays into the idea we discussed before, that you can't have process philosophy without dialectics, because these are dialectical relationships you're talking about between the different levels. So before we go into the Dzogchen, and okay, common question here: what is the difference between moksha and nirvana?
Okay,
because you have moksha, which is like
moksha means liberation, right? Nirvana means putting out. I think that's the etymology. So nirvana means to put out.
Oh, you think you can actually translate them to English? Because knowing sounds great, and knowing
well, nirvana, like again,
hardly any of these words can be translated. So we shouldn't jump to any translations too quickly. But if you try to describe moksha and nirvana in a comparative way, like why do we have the two terms here? Why do we deal with both moksha and nirvana?
I don't know. I sort of thought they were the same thing, more or less. I couldn't tell you. I mean, one of the misconceptions of Buddhism is that the goal is nirvana, but that's not the goal. That's the goal of early Buddhism. But as Thomas said, that is a limited goal, and then in Mahayana there's a larger goal, which is kind of altruism and helping people and compassion and that sort of thing, and wisdom and blah blah blah. And then the Tantra is another goal, but it's definitely not about attaining nirvana. I don't think. Would you agree with that, Thomas? Or
well, in Tantra you have this saying that samsara is nirvana, right?
Right.
So samsara is the cycle of illusion.
Well, it becomes a non-dualistic. It becomes you would call monist. There's no dualism in Tantra. I mean, there shouldn't be a dualism. There's a very subtle dualism that you transcend at each stage.
Yeah, but that's why cut you short when you said liberation. You can't say liberation because in this case, it's obviously liberation from suffering. That's not how you use the word liberation in the English language, at least when you're outside of a Buddhist context.
Moksha means liberation, though, doesn't it? Is it?
No, liberation from suffering. It's not liberation. If you say liberation in English, you mean you're liberated, you're free, the state will no longer control you, or you have tons of money, you can do what you like. That's what we use the word. We use it as equivalent to freedom. Mm-hmm. But liberation here is liberation from suffering, and that's entirely different, meaning that it's death, right? But it's death.
Yeah, but that would not be a tantric view, liberation from suffering, right? So Tantra doesn't.
Yeah.
Tantra is not about removing suffering, or that's the whole point. I mean, it doesn't. So Sutra wants to extinguish desire. So that would be nirvana. There's no desire left. So you're desireless, the dissolution of desire. While Tantra says, oh, no, desire, that's great. Why don't we crank it up and then do interesting stuff with it? So that would be the Tantric view. Yeah. So Tantra celebrates desire, while Sutra wants to curb desire and actually extinguish it, and that's nirvana in the Hinayana and the Sutric sense.
Yeah, and so Tantra is like I've heard it said it's the path of like anger and passion. So the passions are the path, and the anger is but they're transmuted. They're not just stupid passions, that are being expressed.
So would you say in Tantric Buddhism that do you arrive in a pure process, like everything returns to the same in existence? Or is there some kind of an event that changes history?
Changes history.
An event that changes history.
That is what Zoroastrianism teaches, and that's exactly what the vulgar versus Islamic Christianity.
I don't think we care about history too much in Tantric Buddhism. There's not much of a view of history, like ordinary history.
Oh, there's certainly one. Of course there is. You either have a worldview that everything is always the same, returns to the same point again and again and again. So your specific life might be experienced as unique to you, but you're just one of these life forms that sort of circulate and do the same thing over and over again. And then you're all extinguished, eventually going to moksha. And therefore, nirvana is different than moksha, according to me, because nirvana is involved with a personal experience, whereas moksha is more like a general term. That's exactly why the Hindus talk about moksha all the time, but you find nirvana all the time in Buddhism.
Nirvana is considered a personal experience? Because I thought it would be more like the self dies in nirvana, or the self is extinguished. Like in Zen, the paradox.
Yes, you just said that. You said self. But the point with moksha, is that moksha is just that things in general are extinguished. Obviously,
moksha is just death, whereas like the Zen phrase is, when you what is it? If when you die, you don't die, or if you die first before you die, when you die, you don't die, or or you're supposed to die before you die. Instead, you're supposed to die to your limited, individualistic, psychosomatic.
Yeah, but there is why I'm asking about moksha and nirvana. It's such common terms that they need to be defined, and we can ask anybody who watches this conversation to check out for themselves. And learn Sanskrit if you can. But I wanted to define it because before we go from Ana Yoga onto Dzogchen itself, I think that's an important distinction to make.
Okay.
Because the old dog or the old man, you talk about Dzogchen, obviously the guy who does nothing, which is really, really hard, that's why it's the 9th and last level, has a similarity in Zoroastrianism. It's called Harvatat. And Harvatat, roughly translated, means wholeness.
Wholeness, yeah.
There's nothing else to learn. It's like, you were lucky enough to live a long life, if you were lucky enough to live a long life. But you did. You lived a long life. There's nothing really more to learn. It's a sort of saturation level where, yeah, I could go to Madagascar, but I don't care if I did go to Madagascar in my life because I would figure out what Madagascar would be like anyway. It's like you reach a certain point in your life and you've gone through all these different stages and you've lived a full life. So what the Zoroastrians try to do, that's why it's so interesting how it merges with Vajrayana. What the Zoroastrians try to do is to not isolate themselves to go into these practices, which you can do, obviously you can do. And then you're more likely to succeed because you're actually taking a more shamanic route through the practices in Tantric Buddhism. But what the Zoroastrians say that you should not go outside the community, you should try to, within the community, through practices, achieve the same thing. So, for example, the more playful answer a Zoroastrian has to a Buddhist, when a Buddhist says in a more general sense that I aspire towards enlightenment, obviously Tantra doesn't, but Buddhism does in general. So I aspire towards enlightenment, then a Zoroastrian will say, oh, don't worry about that. It's called death, and you will certainly get there anyway. And if you have any sort of experience about it, if you just don't die in a plane crash, well, maybe even then, because it might take seconds, I don't know. But before you die, you would have that experience. Like I've followed people into death who lived long lives, who did everything, who lived intense, full, rich lives, who accomplished everything their libido set out to do. And when they die with more or less a smile on their face, they say, listen, there's only pain and repetition left. I've done it. I've done everything I said to do. And I adopted people, I had children, I passed on things. I was lucky enough to live a full, rich life. And precise description of a full, rich life. But
is that, like in Vajrayana, they would say, maybe you don't believe in this. I don't know. But in Vajrayana, they would say that you achieve the deathless state where there is no death anymore. You just fully.
No, I wouldn't say that. No, I would.
That's what they would say in Vajrayana. I don't think they would. I don't know if they would say that in
I'm very skeptical if anybody talks about deathlessness or timelessness or whatever they talk about, because I think you're just avoiding the topic, which is death. And death is the most difficult topic we could ever consider. So, it's maybe pain, suffering comes on a par with it. Anything that you would like to commit suicide is worse than death. But, death is the ultimate horizon. And I think all religions deal with that, and they deal with it much better than anybody else does to begin with. It's the first thing you need to do in a religion. But I'd love to go into Ana Yoga. If you want to finish that off, we can go into the Dzogchen part. So that would be really interesting.
Well, I like what Thomas was saying about Ana Yoga, holding the difficult emotions and all that. And, he said, to keep from expressing unbridled jouissance, or, So,
yeah, well, then we're back to, remember this quote from Nietzsche that once you had wild dogs in your cellar, your emotions, your violent emotions and your pride and all these things that you were ashamed of, and then they turned into beautiful songbirds. So that's the tantric idea, basically. Nietzsche is so tantric; it's amazing.
That's great.
It's really interesting to read Tantra when you are a bit familiar with read Nietzsche when you are a bit familiar with Tantra, because there's so many common ideas there. Also, the nobility. This like Nietzsche is often appealing to nobility and mastery and things like that. These are very much central to Tantra as well. So
the deity is like the overman in a way, I suppose.
Spacious passion, and also the freedom of the mob, freedom of group thinking. All of these things are very, very close to Tantra, and they're all found in Nietzsche. So, but Alexander, you asked about history. So I think that something like Tantra is very, very different from Christianity, where you really have like an event and a certain, you have like a very historical awareness of this. I think that's not so. Tantra is much more much more experiential, I would say. But it does have it has something called termas. So these are kind of like, so certain gifted gurus, they can discover new teachings that are supposed to come from the Buddha, right? But they're discovered on a rock or something like that. And so that's one mechanism to add new solutions to contemporary problems. So I think you can
But does that involve that the world is new first, or is that just does that come out of nowhere?
Well, termas, for example, Chogyam Trungpa was a master of termas, and so is this guy Tractung that I study with, and they're contemporary teachings of ancient Tantra. So they appear to teachers, in their minds, I guess. And I guess if you believe in weirder, kookier stuff, that they are spoken to you through various forms, and I tend to be kind of flaky in this way, believe it or not.
Yeah, my point was this.
But
wait a second.
Can I just finish?
Okay, that was my point. That wasn't my question. My question was, where does the novelty occur first? Because either the novelty is external to you, something happens that never happened before, and that forces you to rethink the world and come up with new solutions. Or is this an idea that there can be teachers that are so magnificent that they actually outsmart all previous teachers and come up with new ideas or new teachings you've never ever heard before? Is that an internal or external effect, the novelty here? I think that's very important.
Well, if you just make it very practical, if you look at what Trungpa did, right? So he took all the traditional teachings and he reformulated them so that they were suitable for America in the 70s. So and that requires termas, like new revelations, like new techniques that are fitting for the occasion. I think that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's like as if a part of the Bible would appear, to somebody in Yugoslavia. It would be like the Psalms, but it would appear in the 21st century. It's kind of a bit like that.
So in Christianity, you would have another sect, right? And you would have like, okay, there's a new book that appeared, a new prophet. Yeah. So that means that you have to kind of you have to kind of break away from traditional Christianity and form your own Christian sect, right? Like the Mormons and stuff like that. So in.
I would say that's not.
It would basically just incorporate these new elements in the bulk of the teachings.
Okay, but that's not an event, because an event is something historically new that never happened before anywhere. This is just a different environment. It's just adaptation. So, but that's okay.
I don't think it's an event.
I would be surprised there would be an event in here, because if there would be, there'd be much more Persian influence of Vajrayana than we'd ever expected. This is the difference. But if there is a difference in Vajrayana Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, is that Zoroastrianism is built on the idea of the event. It is the first religion built on the idea of the event. That something radically new can happen in history, that changes history forever, that's never happened before anywhere. And therefore, that's why Zoroastrianism does not have its process. It's not, history is never fixed. The surprising thing can happen. The unbelievable thing can happen. And it can change the course of history forever from that point on. That is what the event means. But to adapt something and take it to an environment, yes, that requires teaching mastery. That requires talent. It requires you understand a new language and your new territory. You literally do an exodus territorially to somewhere else to then introduce that religion to other people. That's having a mission, for example. But it's not the same thing as creating an event. I would say that's a difference.
That would be Jewish as well, because the Jews are always waiting around for the Messiah to come, and they're quite optimistic because they sort of believe that the world is getting closer and closer to when the Messiah comes, or
the Messiah has already come. It was called Moses. So they did the Exodus. Then they did the Exodus again for Babylon. Did the Exodus a third time in the 1940s when they went to Israel. Any Orthodox Jew would say we have 3 Exoduses already. So the Messiah could come again. Yeah. So the Messiah can always return in Judaism. It's not something that never happened that you're waiting for. But each time the Messiah comes to the Jews, it is an event.
Yeah.
It's not just a repetition of the same. And that's an idea they got from the Persians, clearly. And so did Christianity.
That's a Western religious thing, right?
Yeah, the ultimate event is Christ on the cross.
Yeah.
Christianity is completely built on one event. It's absolutely central to it.
Yeah, it feels so. If you're familiar with both Christianity and Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism or something like that, then the differences are quite striking. Just the experience of it. It's a completely different way of thinking and a different way of experiencing the religion. The practices are very different. At least that's how I experience.
So will this take us into Dzogchen? Anything more to add, except that it's incredibly hard. You need to be an old man or an old dog to get there. And it looks easy once you're there, but
the other metaphor, it's like a blue pancake that falls in, the sky falls in your head or something like that.
So Dzogchen uses a lot of light. So you always meditate. So for example, you meditate with the eyes open. So there's actually something that many people don't know. So if you do visualizations, then you can close your eyes. So if you visualize yourself as a deity, then you can close your eyes. But otherwise, you can meditate with your eyes open. So in Dzogchen, you meditate with your eyes open. So they often use images such as, for example, well, your experiences, they are clouds in the sky. The sun is never affected by the clouds. So these are Dzogchen images. The practices that are done in Dzogchen, they include, for example, sky gazing. So you go to a high spot in the mountains, and then you just stare into the blue sky for an hour, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So these are very deconstructive meditation techniques.
Yeah.
So they are so there are different types of meditations. You have meditations that are designed to generate compassion. You have meditations that are that generate concentration meditations, visualization, and Dzogchen meditations are often called deconstructive meditations. So
it's in a way it's the ultimate deconstruction, because
instructions would be sit in a meditation posture and keep your eyes open. See you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Then you do that for 9 days. You just sit there, and so you don't have anything to hang on to. There's no practices anymore. So there's no escape, because all of these practices in the lower vehicles, they become crutches, right? So they become like these things that I do, and Dzogchen kind of takes that away. So it's just like just sit down.
So the whole arc of the practice is you create this kind of feast and this whole display of very Baroque thing, and then in the end you dissolve the whole thing, you sweep it all away. Like that's kind of, I think that's kind of how it works.
Wangyal has a very nice he's a very nice text about it. So Tenzin Wangyal is a Dzogchen teacher. He made a lot of secret teachings available, like Tsalung. You can just buy a book now or see the videos on YouTube. Tsalung is really, really nice practice. So he's from the Burn tradition. So that's a kind of a shamanic variant of Vajrayana Buddhism. And so he says, like, so what practice should you then adopt? Should you kind of always be this Dzogchen master, or what should you do? And it's just, well, you do what fits the situation. You can do shamanic practices. So he's burned, so he does shamanic practices. You can do sutric practices, that is renunciation, purification. You can do tantric practices, which are transforming practices, or you can do these self-liberation practices, which are Dzogchen practices. And so it would be arrogant to call yourself a Dzogchen master and then say, like, walk around and go like, oh, I'm in this Dzogchen space. You do what you can, and you do what is relevant in this situation. And this is again related to Maha Yoga, right? You manifest the being, or manifest the identity that fits the occasion.
Yeah, and also you can go through it backwards. Like you could start with Dzogchen, and then you're not good at that. You can't understand that. So then you fall back and you start to do Ana Yoga, and you're not good at that, so you go to Maha Yoga, and then you could go backwards to the thing, and then find out that the best thing for you to do would be sutric practice, like go and help somebody at a soup kitchen, and it just depends, what you're capable of, and what suits your
what your archetype is.
It's very rich. It's amazing how rich these things are, because there's so many different potentials.
Dzogchen includes everything, right? Yeah. You can do strict sutric practices and then internally be a Dzogchen master. So it would make perfect sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So how does this relate to Nietzsche and Girard?
Well, desire, right? I mean, it's the same, and Christianity. So we have Christianity, Girard, we have Buddhism, and Nietzsche. So this is like a really nice set of concepts and traditions to understand the human anthropology, right? So both Buddhism, Christianity, Girard and Nietzsche, they're all concerned with desire. And Lacan, of course, right? So that's basically, so we constantly want stuff. We are constantly have this gap that we want to fill with things, and that can become very dangerous, both for the tribe, for society, and for the individual. And so both Christianity and Buddhism, they try to come up with solutions for this dangerous thing that is called desire. Then Girard, of course, is very sutric, right? So Girard would say, like, well, what's the solution to the current world problems? Everybody should become a Christian, right? So, and that's essentially a sutric solution, right? Everybody should renunciate destructive behavior, do not covet your neighbor's wife, and so on, or your neighbor's ass. I guess that comes in both senses of the word. So that would be Girard's sutric solution. While Nietzsche is more, has kind of stumbled upon a more tantric solution.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. That's why it's interesting to compare the two. So we've gone through it today. We've gone through the three different stages here of the tantric. So where does the sutra come into this, and in what ways Girard sutric, in what ways is Nietzsche's tantric specifically? If you could elaborate on that.
Girard would basically say, well, so he would follow the 10 commandments, right? So, and especially the 10th commandment: do not covet. So do not want what other people want. So do not go into this competition, because then competition creates rivalry creates crisis creates scapegoating, and that can get out of hand. So and he's completely right. But the problem is
a darker version of human nature. It's like completely dark. The sutric view, it's life denying, and finally, from the tantric point of view, and why Nietzsche would criticize that is it's life denying, and Nietzsche hated above all things the life deniers, didn't he? I mean, so I would say that the tantric mentality is to dislike the life deniers. I'd say it's more like, okay, it's a radical change from that, because it incorporates the body and the desires, and it is very life affirmative, I think, which is not what most religions are.
No, I would say that's why Nietzsche went so tantric, because he thought it through fully without knowing it, because obviously that was lacking in the West. And that's the whole point in our current conversation, is that we are strong defenders of some kind of tantric project that's needed in the West. The problem today, though, is that we lost both the sutra and the tantra in Western culture. And we went into this phase of secularization, and we were proud of it, and suddenly we threw out religion. And what we did was that we did something, it's not even pagan when we got back. I mean, paganism had some kind of idea what it was up to. This is so confused now in Europe and North America that I would say this is Sabellian rather than Dionysian, to use Nietzsche's vocabulary. And I don't think Nietzsche even could have predicted this. Even when he talks about the last man, he's talking about something that has lost the Dionysian completely, but that's not the case today. It's not the Dionysian we're seeing in the streets at all. We're seeing the Sabellian. The Dionysian is a risk-taking project. It's like
the Sabellian is what, Alexander? It's the
Dionysian to begin with. The Dionysian to begin with is the revolution. So it can be justified. It can be a good idea for the son to kill the father. It's usually a terrible idea. And sometimes the father has to kill the son because the son was wrong to try to kill him. That's Dionysian. Dionysian is neutral in the sense that it's often required in history. It's often a risk the collective needs to take. It needs to go into this revolutionary mode. It's a Dionysian. But the Sabellian is when a force comes into the picture. It comes from Cybele, the goddess. Even the Greeks consider her to be a non-Greek goddess. We should emphasize that. Like she was imported from another culture. She came from the East somewhere, but she wasn't Greek. The point is that Cybele was a goddess who fell in love with her own son. And therefore, her son had to be castrated. So she couldn't have sex with her own son. So she's this goddess of resentment.
Castration, basically.
Yeah, the goddess of resentment, who is followed by the eunuchs. It's the eunuchs. It's the castrated people who follow her. So this is like the ultimate form of slave morality. This is slave morality celebrating itself, set out to kill any kind of master morality that exists anywhere. So this is like the ultimate Nietzsche nightmare. It's like he didn't even see that happening. But that's actually the problem today, that we see the Sibelian return in history for the first time in a long time. Well, it was the Chinese Cultural Revolution, certainly. And we saw it with the Jacobins during the French Revolution. We've seen this in the past with all these peace sticks running around and, you know, with the vegan food and everything, and they're going to save the world, and Greta Thunberg's at the front or whatever. Then they probably sweep Greta away too, and something much nastier is going to come after it. It's completely dystopian. But I would say in Lacanese, you would say that it's enjoying the dystopia. This is the enjoyment of the dystopia. This is like, I'm enjoying my castration. I'm enjoying that I'm shortcut. I'm enjoying my slavery. And I will have my slavery no matter what. And I will actually demand that the slave is considered as the master. Completely. So it's not about overthrowing something to install a new mastery, which is what the Dionysians had to do. The Sibelian force, which rarely comes into history, but you got the Apollonian, the Dionysian that Nietzsche talks about. And what was lacking, we discussed about what is lacking in Nietzsche, it's the split of the Dionysian. And the split Dionysian is the proper Dionysian and the Sibelian. And the Sibelian is when you got a lynch mob running down the street. That is not even pagan. It's not even...
Pagan would be organized, right? So...
it would be organized, and it would find the scapegoat, and it would turn the scapegoat into some kind of a god. That's what Girard is discussing. But the lynch mob that is Sibelian will go after you and kill you, and they will literally just jump on you, and they will forget about you and find the next one right away.
So
is
it
devastating?
You said it like fascist Germany, right? The Nazis. That was paganism, organized Dionysian. And then a complete, let's say, like the Rwanda killings, that's more Sibelian, or how would I see that?
Yeah, I would say.
Let's not forget that paganism can be a structuring mechanism, right? So the Roman Empire was a pagan empire. So you can structure an entire empire upon pagan scapegoating mechanisms. That's possible. Basically, people have been doing that for thousands of years.
Yeah. There's a way in which I dislike the use of the word pagan, because it seems to disrespect the cultures of.
Because I mean, I'm kind of a bit tired of these Christians who put on these costumes, and then they love nature and stuff like that, and then they call it paganism. I mean, loving nature, that 19th century romanticism. The Roman Empire, which was the pagan empire per definition, was not built on nature worship, right? It was built on brutal scapegoating of slaves and based on crucifixion and torture. People don't want to hear that, but it was like that. The ancient Greek civilization that everybody so admires, they kept slaves that they could torture and kill regularly in festivals. These are pagan societies. They are radically alien to us, and we have forgotten that. So this romantic dream on paganism, right? I mean, I'm totally not on board with that.
And it's back, but it's back and it's even worse, precisely because it's naive paganism. And naive paganism is when you go Sibelian. I would say with Hitler and the Nazis, you probably both elements. He started out as a Dionysian, certainly, but a Gnostic one. I think the Gnosticism was problematic with Hitler. So he would take tons of drugs and then attack Russia. That failed. Stalin fooled him. And when he realized that Stalin had fooled him, it walked into Stalin's trap. He started building concentration camps, like if that would solve anything, like I'm going to drag everybody with me while I go down. That's the Sibelian take on Hitler. That's like, when Hitler finally shoots himself and says that the Russians actually won, they are superior to the Germans, and I will be consequent with my ethics. I will kill myself. No, that's Sibelian. So he would have loved to take the Russians with him too if he could. There was a point of no return from 1941 onwards when Hitler would just go down and drag anything he could find with him. And that's exactly what the Sibelian force is. The Sibelian force is pure resentment, as Nietzsche would say. So that's why,
because the pagan doesn't really have resentment.
That's lacking in it. Nietzsche doesn't have a full picture of this, but it's two forces we know, Apollonian, Dionysian, that we deal with constantly. And it's order and chaos in many ways. But then there's a third one that pops up in history. And it pops up when we have a confused population without a tribal structure. So, for example, the way Zoroastrians would attack paganism or naive paganism is that they would say that what Zoroastrianism presents, and it's a Zoroastrian alternative to stop the scapegoat mechanism, is to say that we're an imperial religion, imperial order. That means that if we conquer another territory, we will not boil their children in oil like the Syrians did. We will actually try to domesticate them and then turn them into ours. So we will actually turn them over to our side so they can serve, but it will be our empire. And that's, of course, what Islam later inherits. cleverly when Islam says that we're going to conquer all the world, but every people we conquer, we're going to force them to convert to Islam. And if they do, they're with us. But if they won't, then we kill them. Okay, it's a kind of a weird way to convert somebody, isn't it? But it's at least better than the Syrians just would boil your children in oil and kill you, obviously. So it's kind of a new level of civilization that is required to withhold an empire, make an empire work over time. The Romans tried to combine these two things. So what the Roman Empire did was that it kept paganism in all its brutality, obviously, but it also tried to keep a more civilized imperial order at the same time. And that obviously finally fell apart. And when it fell apart in the 5th century, what saved it was you had two alternatives. You either went for the military religion, was Mithraism, or you went for the mother and child religion, was Christianity. And by making itself a military religion, which Christianity cleverly did, they took over the Roman Empire. And then, because of internal conflicts within Christianity, this was theologically impossible to be both emperor and also worship God within Christianity. It had to separate itself. And what uniquely and smartly did, and therefore kept its position in Europe, was that it said, we'll have a pope. The Pope will be responsible to God. We will not have territorial claims. So we separate church and state. And that's exactly what created Christian Europe over the next 1600 years. That's the sort of Europe we live with ever since. But I would say that what the Zoroastrians did was that they did maintain their empire. But once the empire fell, the Pahlavi sect among the Zoroastrians decided to leave Zoroastrianism and basically set up Islam. And that's why I'm saying Islam is child of Zoroastrianism. I would argue it's a more vulgar version of it because it's Gnostic, fundamentally Gnostic as a religion. That's why I prefer to be a Zoroastrian. But to understand how Zoroastrianism passes on to Islam is also very helpful when trying to understand how Judaism passes on to Christianity. We're all dealing with the scapegoat mechanism, but I think the point here is that probably Girard is missing out, is that it's missing out on the importance of scale. So it's not in Nietzsche either. As long as the scale is tribal, most things work. As long as the tribe that's set off and has a membrane towards the outside world, so it's protected from the outside world, then the tribal order works because we lived with it for millions of years and certainly lived with it for hundreds of thousands of years. So our evolution adapt to it. But when we try to create larger populations that are being controlled under one roof, like a written language can be written and therefore used by a lot more people than a spoken language, which is usually only a dialect anyway. And once you expand the territory linguistically, and you expand the territory culturally, and you settle down, and finally, you don't just have a village along a river, you have the entire river valley suddenly under your order. You need to invent new forms of government and new forms of control that are much larger than tribal. But all of those larger scales fight and struggle with the human mentality. And that's exactly why you have to invent, to develop after a while, new narratives and new orders and new practices that try to control and contain the powers at larger scales. And that's why I'm interested in Vajrayana. I'm interested in Christianity. I'm interested in Islam, Zoroastrianism. All these religious systems are the only really decent systems we have historically that have tried to develop to larger scales. Compared to the political ideologies we've developed over the last 100 years, they're nothing. That's why secular society will fall apart and cannot withstand its current crisis. We have to go back to religion because it's only through these sort of interwoven great religious systems in dialogue with each other you can develop systems that make sense today when the scale is global, to be honest about it. Yeah. That's the problem. This is what Derrida and Levinas deal a lot with. They deal a lot with how do you deal with a stranger? It's the Girardian question. How do you not just envy your neighbor for his wife, but how do you deal with a stranger who just walked through the door? How do you not kill him?
Yeah. That's why I was interested actually in this Bengalese Tantric period where the Hindus and the Zoroastrians and the Buddhists and as you were saying, Alexander, there weren't these strict labels and definitions. There was a bunch of schools. Yeah, and they were very much learning from each other and evolving despite their differences. So
you
for example, like Vajrayana Tantra is kind of dry, but when you mix it with a bit of Hinduism and a bit of Hindu Tantra, when you mix the two together, it's like the mixture of feminine and masculine. There's more poetry that comes from that. There's more culture and more art and less monasticism and anyway.
Yeah, but that's what you get along the trade routes. Why do you think I'm so obsessed with the Silk Road?
The trade routes, yeah.
Okay, and why do you think Camille Paglia is working on nomadic life in North America before the white people arrived? I mean, we're all now looking at models like, what would it be like to be semi-nomadic? What would it like to be nomadic? How do you think? How do you perceive the world then? And then see if we can learn anything we can take with us, because the current problem we need to solve is always a problem of scaling up. And scaling up the different ideas. And that's exactly what civilization has tried to deal with all along. All of these religions do that. But besides what you just said, that's exactly what the Zoroastrianism is skeptical of the guy who goes out in the forest and isolates himself to sit there for 14 years or whatever, if he wants to do it. But the Zoroastrian take is that, yes, you can go out in the forest, you can sit there and isolate yourself for 40 years and be a hermit, but you better return to the community. Because the whole point is not that you are going to find yourself sitting there, or you're going to be a god on your own. Because the point with that is that you're going to return one day and say, listen, I isolated myself from 14 years. And because of that, I reach a certain wisdom, which I can contribute to the community.
Of course.
Returning to the community is the sacred thing in Zoroastrianism.
That's the Zen ox herding
back
pictures.
Into the community. Yeah.
And the Zen ox herding pictures, the last picture is he comes back to the community with, he goes off into emptiness and then he comes back to the community. It's
like a trader. I mean, if a guy says, I'm going to go out there in the world and make tons of money, I'm never going to return. Well, why would you care? If you fostered the guy and he leaves, you'd probably kill him because he's of no use to you. You spent 18 years fostering this kid and he wants to go out somewhere in the world and it's never going to return with anything, is he? But if he says that, I'm going to go out there in the world, see if I can conquer the world, it might take a few years before I get back. When I get back, I'm going to have stuff with me and I'm going to impress you guys and I'm going to have an abundance to present to you. Like the hunter who then becomes the trader. And that is, of course, what we're looking at here, but the spiritual version of the same thing. What do you bring back to the community at the end of the day? And to the Zoroastrian, you cannot reach Harvatat, which obviously is the equivalent to your doctrine. You cannot reach Harvatat unless that is your contribution back to the community. Otherwise, you're just narcissistic. What was the point?
Yeah. That's the Bodhisattva as well, in a sense. The Bodhisattva actually rejects nirvana, right? He absolutely rejects nirvana, refuses to go into a state of nirvana until he's contributed, until he's liberated beings. That's the Mahayana.
So that's already corrected at the third vehicle.
Yeah.
Right. So the third vehicle is a Mahayana vehicle, and that basically. So that's not so Mahayana said, well, it's not about reaching some individual state of enlightenment, but it's actually about the community. So why don't you stop this, don't become a Buddha and disappear, but actually stay here on purpose and serve the community. So that comes at a very initial level, basically. So that's the third vehicle.
Yeah, what you then do is Zoroastrianism is that Harvatat is followed by Shinavat. Shinavat is like, it's perceived as a bridge. It's visualized like a bridge, meaning you die, you go somewhere else, but you're literally dying, right? You're going back to the womb, whatever you want to call it symbolically, because despite the fact the word paradise is Persian, there's no talk of a paradise anywhere in Zoroastrianism. You literally die, you're done, you are done. But Ameritat is what follows, and that is wrongly translated as immortality in most translations in the West, which is dead wrong when you look at the word. Ameritat literally means what survives you, what transcends you. It's not you transcending, it's that which transcends you, which is, of course, your heritage, your children, the next generation, what you passed on. And that you're allowed to dream about as much as you like during your life. And actually you should, because the ultimate goal of what you do in your life is to create some kind of value and abundance that's passed on to the next generation. That is why it's the ultimate eventological religion in the sense that it says that, what if you actually pass something on that'd be so tremendous that it would be considered an event after you died? So after you died, this would have been used to change the world radically for the better. Well, you have to live with the fact that you probably never will experience that. It's not yours. It's not yours at all. But to think that you participate in a project that makes your proper Ameritat possible, you're perfectly allowed to contemplate during your life. Mm-hmm. So death is incredibly important here. The Shinavat, that's what they deal with, and that's why I think it ties in with me with Hegel. Hegel also says that, death is the thing, and so does Nietzsche. I mean, these guys are very serious about that. They say that everything valuable in our life is valuable to us because we know that we're mortal. We cannot comprehend that we're going to die. Like Heidegger says it, it's like the whole world dies with us when we die. Maybe that's a bit Heideggerian, but it's like death is an incredibly intense thing, at least prior to it happening, but it creates all the values prior to it. And that's why I think the Zoroastrians were right to emphasize. To have lived a full whole life is a goal in itself, but to then actually create a value that other people can use after you've died, or to pass on a heritage that gives your children a great chance in life or whatever, that is a great thing to do. That's what Zoroastrianism is so successful socially. It's even more successful than Judaism, and being a religion that actually creates a very successful community. That's what I was interested in to begin with. The Parsis of India are by far the wealthiest people you ever find on the planet, and they've been like that for 2,000 years. So there you go. Yeah, okay. Where are we at?
What about? I think we solved all the world's problems, so we can. This is the final podcast. And no.
What about distinguishing between fake sutra and fake tantra? I'm just looking at Thomas's notes.
Yeah, I'm also interested, Thomas. You say all the time that Nietzsche is a Christian, but here you say Nietzsche is tantric. I agree on the latter. I don't agree on the first.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of like.
I think he's actually. I think actually, I'm more Christian than Nietzsche is, because he's so anti-Christian that it's unbelievable.
Yeah, but it depends a bit what you. So, I mean, I'm talking in about tantra in generalized terms, right? So, if you would talk to a traditional Buddhist, he would give you a very different story. So, I'm kind of like looking at tantra and trying to figure out now what are the core ideas here, right? And I've done the same thing with Christianity. And with respect to the exposure of the scapegoat mechanism, right? With the danger of the mob, the people become mobs and they kill scapegoats. This is a central concern of Christianity, although many Christians have no clue about this. But this is the core of their religion. And Nietzsche was very concerned with exactly the same problem, the problem of mobs. His overman is the individual that doesn't follow the mob. Nietzsche would have hated Nazi Germany because it's the prime example of a mob. He would have hated it. So that's a very Christian stance. So I'm not saying that Nietzsche is Christian in the sense that he believes in a life after death and stuff like that. I find these ideas, they are going around in Christianity. I don't find them particularly valuable. So that is something that Christianity has developed, the life after death and stuff like that, and this obsession with sexuality. These are aspects of Christianity that I find they're kind of like random elements that have been added to a central good idea. So Whitehead said it like this, right? Buddhism is a metaphysics looking for a story, and Christianity is a story looking for a metaphysics.
That's good.
So the story,
I like that.
I would even say, what I think. I had a brief discussion with Jonathan Potro today, and I think Girard will take over Christianity. I think theology will go through a Girardian revolution. I think it's not only Christianity's only chance to be credible again, but I think it actually spreads like wildfire at the moment. My equivalent to that, we were looking at it before, will be the Zoroastrian equivalent of trying to tame the scapegoat. And because we were looking in the wrong place, because Zoroastrianism does precisely this by being imperial and military. It's on a different level, but that's exactly when you conquer your enemy's territory, you must not boil his children in oil. You must win him over. And the difference between Islam and Zoroastrianism is in Zoroastrianism, you don't even have to convert him. You allow him to keep his religion. He can keep his religion as long as he goes into the imperial order.
Wasn't that like the British Empire? I don't see what's
it's completely innovated by the Persians. If you see it anywhere else in the British Empire, well, you didn't. It was ruthless. But if you see it, say, for example, in the U.S. Constitution, it started with the Persians. It started with splitting power. And through splitting power, you started to control the scapegoat mechanism. Because to the Zoroastrians, the problem with the scapegoat mechanism was the violence of war. It wasn't the violence of the mob. I'm sure they had mobs too, but they figured out that if we solve the scapegoat mechanism problem on the world level, and here the scapegoat is the baby, the child of your enemy that you would love to boil in oil in front of your enemy before you kill him, which means you kill his heritage and then you kill him. So there can be no Ameritat, there can be no Harvatat. And what the Zoroastrians decided to do, and this is Cyrus the Great. I think my event from antiquity is when Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon and decides to go through Babylon and kiss the feet of the Babylonian god Marduk. And it shocked the world. This is probably the most stunning thing anybody ever did. The stunning thing ever did, this is on the 6th century before Christ. The Persians conquered Babylon. And thereby the Babylonians decided we should be part of the Persian Empire. The war was over. They could worship Marduk as much as they like. And what Islam then vulgarly does is that it forces you to convert to their religion to mimic what the Persians did because it was a successful formula. But the problem with the Arabs when they did that was that they say, you must convert to Islam or we'll kill you. But that's not a conversion. A forced conversion is no conversion at all. And that's always been the problem with Islam. The guys who did mimic the Persians, though, were the Mongols. And the Mongols had their own religion, Tengrism, which is basically a copy of Zoroastrianism. It was an own unitary, power-splitting, phallus worship religion, Tengrism, in Mongolia. And then they conquered the rest of the world, bloodily so, yes. But once they've conquered the world in the 13th century, the Mongols said that you can have any religion you like, just as long as you pay tax to the emperor, which was exact copy of the Persian Empire. So they are dealing with the scapegoat mechanism on a different level. To them, it is, how do you civilize war? War is going to be around, violence will be there, the urge to conquer territory will always be there, and so war will always exist. But how do you make war as civilized as you possibly could be? That was the Zoroastrian question that they tried to solve. Whereas Christianity then, in a complementary way, moved down to the sort of street level where you got the slave mentality, and then realized that the slave mentality is what causes these mobs, and you must not kill the scapegoat. That, I think, is the difference.
Yeah.
Are you there, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm there.
There are other... so the Romans also did that, right? So they allowed people to keep their religion. And also in Islam, you actually have periods like El-Andalus in Spain. So there, Muslim, so you could be a Jew and a Christian, you just have to pay more taxes. So these.
But that's different though. That's different though. That's because Islam instated, probably Zoroastrian idea in Islam, they instated that all the religions of the book, so all the religions that prior to Islam, which includes Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity, are also holy religions. That's why you have Zoroastrian representatives, Jewish representatives, Christian representatives in the Majlis, in the parliament in Iran today. It's impossible in Islam to kill those who belong to it, but they must not proselytize in Islam. So you're not allowed to convert as a Muslim to the older religions, but you can keep the older religions to keep them within the realm, and therefore they must be protected, which is why Muslims have been much nicer to Jews historically than the Christians were. Ironically, of course, today they've shifted that. But, historically, the Muslims treated the Jews way better than the Christians did. But there's an explanation for that. It's called the religions of the book in Islam, the religions of the book.
So we have a religion that is built upon the exposure and the rejection of the scapegoat mechanism, and even that religion cannot escape scapegoating on a massive scale. Christians have been burning Jews, they've been burning women, they've been burning heretics for 2,000 years. So this is kind of a bit ominous, right? So even a religion that actually really, in some sense, gets it, or gets at least an important part of human anthropology, so even that religion completely fucks up in many cases. So it seems to be that we are facing a pretty daunting task.
Yeah, but I think statistically, I would defend both Christianity and Zoroastrianism here. I think statistically speaking, if you look at the data, the much larger populations and the more territories that were covered, I think actually you did minimize the lynch mobbing. I think Christianity successfully did that, even if it did the pogroms and everything. But I think exactly if you look at what happened in the 20th century, when we got rid of Christianity in the West, we got Hitler and Stalin. And I am furious with people who don't want to realize that Hitler and Stalin are atheists and pagans. If you don't accept that they're completely post-Christian. There's nothing Christian about Hitler and Stalin at all. And that's exactly why I'm terrified of the woke lynch mobs today. I don't think at all they realize that they're basically a terrible Western mimicry of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And that was devastating. I don't want Pol Pot's Cambodia again, It's
a Christian sect. It's these people, so the woke masses, right? This is a Christian Puritan sect. Very simple. They don't even know
it's not even Christian. It's post-Christian.
No, it's kind of like a parody of Christianity, right? I mean, Girard
it's a parody of Christianity.
It's not Christian, but they kind of take the ideas of Christianity, namely protect the scapegoat, which is a Christian obsession, and rightfully so. And then they use that obsession to make scapegoats and to go completely pagan. We discussed this many times, right? But I find it so amusing to kind of see that. I mean, Girard has described this brilliantly in his books.
Guys, I'm like through a third of my notes I had for this conversation, but I have to finish off. So
right.
I'd love to continue the conversations. I'd love these conversations with you guys.